So in the previous session, we talked about climate. And in terms of climate science, you can see here that the worse global warming becomes, the worse it will impact ecosystems, be it fisheries, coral reefs, um, species loss, whether it's plants or vertebrates. So there is a connection between climate and nature. So if we don't solve climate, we won't be able to solve the nature crisis, and we won't be able to solve the climate crisis without solving the nature crisis. And this is what really is the crisis all about. The other, the other precondition for life on this planet beyond a stable climate is a rich biodiversity of life. And that's what's being degraded and declining over the past few decades in terms of biodiversity. And this is the reason why last December, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was forged. That is the Paris Agreement for Nature, so to speak, right? So there is already that agreement for nature, and then there's even more. The UN High Seas Treaties was forged this March. That means beyond exclusive economic zones, beyond coastal areas, there's now an ocean management treaty for those on the high seas, where a lot of activities actually are happening, whether it's illegal fishing or other things. So they say the high seas at the moment is like the Wild West. So this is trying to contain high sea treaty management. And then there's the Plastic Pollution Treaty, where UNEP, in fact, is leading that agenda, and there will be a treaty forged by next year. So if there's net zero insurance on the climate change mitigation side, there's a nature positive agenda on the nature agenda. And the agenda is to reverse nature loss this decade because all the vital stats are showing red. How do we turn the tide this decade, and how can we regenerate and have full recovery by mid-century, in the same way that we want to get to net zero emissions by 2050. That's the agenda for nature. What has been the agenda for the principles for stable insurance over the years? We've been working on nature over the years. We've had work with WWF on UNESCO on how to protect, how insurers can protect natural World Heritage sites, be it the Great Barrier Reef or the Okavango Delta. How can we ensure that those who write marine insurance don't inadvertently underwrite vessels involved in illegal fishing? Because that has happened. And illegal fishing is one of the most destructive practices on the ocean, destroying ecosystems in addition to human rights issues. Then there's the plastic pollution way ahead. Before plastic pollution became really being mainstream in finance right now, we already had a groundbreaking study on how insurers can support a transition to an economy that really reduces plastic pollution. And hydropower, high impact hydropower, if you're talking about large scale infrastructure projects where insurance, blending and investment is involved, that has been quite damaging for the nature agenda. And we've already produced a guide together with WWF on that, all the way to environmental pollution liability. So there's been a lot of work by insurers on this. But the agenda is how can we, just like in the other session, beyond conceptual things, how can we actually bring this into practice? So we at UNEP coined the Nature Positive Insurance Agenda, just as we created the Net Zero Insurance Agenda. And we did this together with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the equivalent of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this year we'll be producing a paper on what is nature positive insurance, just like we produced a paper last year on what is net zero insurance. my final slide is one of my favorites nowadays, is to show these are the warming stripes for the last half century. So we're going really to the red zone over the past few decades. And you can see how on the nature side, the one at the bottom, how the stripes show that as the planet warms, we have been degrading nature. And nature is a carbon sink. Mangroves, tropical forests, seagrasses, they all store carbon. So as we degrade nature, it also releases greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why this is not a separate agenda. Nature and climate are two sides of the same coin. So let's get going. So the rest of the panel, we have Dorothy Maseke, who I've known for the past 2 years, and is now, let me see where she's working right now. Yes, she's moved different places, but wherever she is, she's been a champion of sustainability. And now she is at FSD Africa, being the Nature and Finance and TNFD. The TNFD is Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. That's really a mouthful. It's TNFD. And then we have my colleague Dennis, who's the Associate Nature Lead. And we have, there's Caroline Sonje, who used to be our colleague at UNEP here in Africa, and she's now with ICEA Lion in Kenya. So it's great to have them on board. Let's start with Dorothy. Dorothy, your thoughts at FSD Africa. Kelvin was on the first panel on climate. What is the agenda for FSD Africa? Why did you move? And why are you taking on this agenda and bringing in your passion on sustainability to the nature agenda? So I should rephrase that more towards that.
Yeah, so sitting here with two bosses, my former boss Philip and my new boss Kelvin, is very strange. But yes, and quite challenging at the same time. But I want to mention that, yes, the nature agenda at FSD Africa is big. And this is really based on the premise or recognition that, as you said, Butch, you cannot separate nature from climate. They are inextricably linked. They are basically two sides of the same coin. But I think one of the things that we are getting to see more is that people actually connect a little more with nature. So when you tell communities about 1.5 degrees and the Paris Agreement and all these things, it becomes difficult for them to understand. But when you tell them that, look, you need to plant trees because trees bring rain. When they see oceans rising and wiping away previous coastal communities, their homes, then it's easier for them to understand. So nature is a little more localized. And therefore, possibly a new agenda item, yes, but possibly simpler for communities, and in this particular case, very important for the financial sector. Africa has 30%, actually 65% of the world's arable land sits in Africa. At the same time, Africa has about 25% to 30% of the world's species. So you can understand and see the effect of nature on anything in terms of the African economy. And so why is nature important for FSD Africa? Because it's very important because it is basically a key cog to economic resilience within this continent. And I'll unpack maybe in a few minutes, a couple of things that we are doing within the nature agenda. And TNFD is one of those. But more importantly, bringing together the financial community is a big part of that agenda. Apart from that, you spoke about the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. What we're also doing at FSD Africa is we are supporting a number of African countries to develop nature action plans in line with the GBF. because once these countries are able to develop what you call 30 by 30 plans, meaning they've promised or purposed to restore 30% of land, 30% of oceans, then it also becomes a good place for regulations by regulators to be put in place and then to drive the agenda forward. But I'll unpack more in a few. Thanks.
Thank you, Dorothy. I want to challenge you a little bit on what you said. So I think when you said that people can relate a little bit more to nature compared to the 1.5 degrees, I think if I understood correctly, you are probably referring to the emissions agenda, right? Greenhouse gas emissions, how does that relate to me, right, etc. But when you talk about climate change impacts, I guess people can relate to extreme weather, whether it's drought, etc. The other thing that you mentioned, which is interesting, is nature is actually quite local. And I think that is a challenge, because if you look at emissions, you measure carbon the same everywhere in the world. But you measure nature, that's different. The ecosystem here in Namibia is different from the boreal forest in Canada or the tropical forest in my country, the Philippines, right? So what is the answer there in terms of, like, you're saying that it's more localized, it also presents challenges, right? I guess in terms of measuring the value of localized ecosystems. Is that correct, or?
Yes, that's exactly it. It's localized in the context that communities, nations, countries are actually able to see those effects. And most of these effects are also immediate. So when it floods, for example, because this coral reefs have been destroyed or mangroves have been destroyed, this flooding happens now. We may talk about the effects in 5 years, but when this happens, it happens at that particular point. So the localization component of it is very key. And again, the diversity in terms of the different effects within different areas. If you look at Kenya, then the environment, the ecosystems are very different. If you look at the wetlands in Kenya, for example, and you compare to other wetlands, then very different. And so that's the point about the localization aspect of it.
Thank you, Dorothy. Let's listen to ICEA Alliance, so primary insurer in East Africa, predominantly in East Africa. And it's great to have actually my former colleague there, Caroline, embedding ESG. Caroline, what's the thinking on nature positive insurance at ICEA Alliance? Can you share a little bit of your thoughts on this agenda?
Okay. Thanks, Butch. You know, I don't like that name, Caroline. I don't know why you're insisting on it.
Okay,
But
should I say Sonje? You prefer? I forget now. It's been some time since I saw you last.
yeah, so, well, it's fine. And you asked Dorothy why she left? Probably I have an answer. She left so that I can take over. Well, anyway, so yeah, at ICEA Lion, and I believe also all the members who've signed up to the Nairobi Declaration for Sustainable Insurance, we're all thinking about nature and transitioning from, you know, the traditional aspect of insurance to now incorporate nature and environmental matters in our business. That is in underwriting in all our operations as a business, as well as to influence all our stakeholders to do the same, because we all have to work together towards a common goal. In fact, what I like saying is when it comes to nature, because, you know, actually my background is environment, but when I go to the corporate world, there was a lot of, you know, competition. But I like when we integrate nature into the business, we can now say we have to work together towards a common goal, and not really forget competition, but just come together and collaborate. So yes, as you say, transition from the traditional way of doing business, incorporate ESG matters into the business, and adopt also nature-related solutions. Case in point, what has been talked about, and also what I picked from Dorothy, now hoping to take it forward, the plan of working with WWF, FSD, so that you can come up with a solution for mangroves and coral, which is very key to me, close to heart, because I'm coastarian. I come from the Kenyan coast. Probably that's why you're seeing layered up like an onion. I do not like the cold at all. Yeah, but yeah, so that's close to my heart. And also a lot of other nature-based solutions, like what has been mentioned was also mentioned earlier by our CEO, the index-based livestock solution in Kenya, which is a consortium of a number of underwriters with the government to tackle, issues. A lot has been talked about the drought which has been going on in Kenya, and of course loss of animals, a lot of losses in agriculture. So this helps to assist on that, because it actually tackles, instead of waiting for the animals to actually die, so it's not an indemnity kind of insurance, but it actually is triggered at the time when you realize that there's loss of pasture and you see these animals are going to perish, then the insurance is triggered to provide pasture and water. So it's more of a preventive, which was not, it was not a traditional way of doing things. And also in partnership with the government, because the government is the one which is providing the premium subsidies. Yeah, and of course, as I talked about initially, the non-traditional way of insurance is collaborations. As you see, a lot of collaborations like the Nairobi Declaration, like the UNEP, FI, PSI, which I'm assuming all of us are members here, and the Nairobi Declaration, a lot has been mentioned about it, and I believe more will be mentioned on it. Like, I believe on Friday, there's actually a workshop on that entirely for Nairobi Declaration, so probably all of you, and also encourage more to come on board and hear about it, and also sign on to it, so that we can work together as an African continent on this ESG journey. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonje. I'm going to probe you and Dorothy a little bit more before I go to Dennis. So, yeah, let's go to the solution set later on. I think nature-based solutions are great, and I have questions on ensuring nature. But let's go a step back on the risk management continuum in insurance and go to risk analytics and the do no harm agenda, right? So before you get to insurance, there's analytics involved. So 10 years ago, we convened like the best minds on risk modeling in the global insurance industry, and I asked a question: does your model on hazard, exposure, and vulnerability include natural ecosystems? And the answer was no, right? So my question is that, how is the risk analytics evolving in an insurance company? Is that happening right now in African insurance companies' risk analytics, that nature is part of the analytics, that if you look at the coast, if that coral reef is intact, there's going to be less storm surge for that coastal community, et cetera, et cetera. Where is that now?
So let me start. At FSD, we are supporting what you call the TNFD Africa Pilot Group. So basically, we have a group of financial institutions, some of who are actually PSI members, who are testing the TNFD framework. One of the things that is continuously coming through, and it is very interesting and surprising, is that many of these pilot institutions actually have the risk analytics data. They have subscribed to databases that are able to show them climate change losses, habitat losses, and even pollution. And basically, the data is still developing. And I know we'll talk about it, it's a challenge, but it is surprising that a lot of satellite data is already available. The challenge is these tools are expensive, and these institutions need to pay for these tools. So you'll find it's largely the large kind of organizations, yes, like I've mentioned, some of them are in the pilot group, that have actually subscribed to these databases. These databases, like you said, can show them where the coral reefs are most in danger. These databases have satellite data, real-time satellite data on vessels that are moving across, such that by the time you're insuring this vessel or this particular ship, you're able to tell and you're able to know whether this ship is using, of course, there are those predefined routes, but then there are high-risk routes high-risk routes, routes where, you know, when the vessels pass, it affects the migratory patterns of the fish and many other things, including breeding, etc. And of course, the pollution that arises out of some of these vessels. And what is coming through is some of these underwriters are actually making decisions, making demands. Let me not say, some of them have made tough decisions, some of them are making demands from their clients. These tools are also available to show you the pollution areas. So just apart from habitat loss, whether it's within the ocean, whether it's within a wetland, whether it's within a river. For example, we know oil companies are now putting up pipelines. Some of these pipelines may be crossing through some rivers or some protected areas. And data is now available. And these insurers can actually ask the questions when these pipelines are being set up, whether these pipelines are going to be terrestrial or whether they'll be subterrestrial. And those are some of the things, discussions that are going on.
Right. So what you're saying, Dorothy, is that so data and information is power, but is that a public good or no? At the moment, it's those who can afford it can have it, but that means it's not a level playing field, right? So do we have now an agenda to make that a public good?
I think you've been sitting in some of our FSD meetings because
I haven't been.
Because we have been, the pilot group has actually challenged FSD and some of the partners that we are working with to democratize this data. And those are some of the initiatives that as a pilot group we are thinking about in terms of what can we do for the African continent. I'll give an example, and I won't name them because they may listen to me. Some of these tools cost in upwards of 60, 70, 80,000 USD, either per month, depending on what you take on, or per annum. And so the challenge that these underwriters are saying, one, can we come together as a consortium and purchase some of these tools and have a better negotiating power? Secondly, what can we do as development partners, as governments, because with this kind of data, nature data, you need scientists. So you need biodiversity specialists who have the data. You need meteorology, those stations, that word is hard for me. You need all these people to come together who have the data. Then you need the economic plans. You need to be able to understand these biodiversity losses, and that's the gap. That's the gap that we have. We have very good satellite data, but not linked to any economies or economic plans or any economic losses that you can quantify. So the best you can do is survive or rely on World Bank data, IFC data, but the pilot group members are challenging us, and we've taken on that challenge. So hopefully within a year or two, you should be hearing some announcements on data.
Good, and there's a parallel on net zero. And if you look at the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero Network, they have what they call the Net Zero Data Public Utility. So it means we need to have an NPDPU, a nature positive data public utility that could be used by underwriters across the continent and the Middle East so that they can underwrite with nature integrated into that underwriting decision. Is that good? Let's do it. Good. All right, we're progressing with solutions. Good. Now I'm going to go to my colleague Dennis, and he has two roles at UNEP. One is that he's Aquaman. He's our blue economy expert. So ocean-based economy, and he's also the deputy lead, associate lead for nature. So the wider nature agenda. And I'm going to expose Dennis because I'm filled with envy that he spent several days in the Namib Desert before this conference. So he has been exposed to nature already before the conference, and I cannot do it, and that's why I'm going to expose him. So Dennis, what did you learn in the Namib Desert first? What struck you? What is the ecosystem that you saw there?
That is a question I'm not prepared for, but it was magnificent, and I don't think I've ever seen that much empty space before in my life, and lots of wildlife just roaming around, beautiful mountains and sand dunes, and really also ancient ecosystems. And despite it on first glance looking empty, there's always life anywhere you would look. That was quite impressive, I think. And different to what I'm used to, which is the ocean environment, right?
So I was telling Dennis that he's now also our pink economy expert, given that he said the U looked like pink, right?
It did indeed, yes, it did.
Yeah. So let's go to the blue economy. Dennis, what's the work here on, what's the agenda for insurers and the ocean-based economy? And I mean, we've been talking about, we can talk about forests, but mangroves would be part of that agenda,
Yes.
right? Coral reefs are also part of that agenda. The marine industry is part of that agenda. Tourism is big, right? So
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's...
what's the agenda for insurers here? First on the blue economy side of things.
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna take a couple of steps back. I mean, when we talk about the blue economy, it's not. I'm gonna warn you, it's not a like an official definition. Doesn't really exist. So depending on who you ask, they might think of different things. A lot of people, if you talk about the ocean economy, they include anything that is happening within an ocean space. So it would include, for example, offshore oil and gas and dredging and other things. Whereas at UNEP, we really want to highlight that we're talking about a sustainable blue economy, and that means we're looking at sectors that are impacted by the state of the ocean, which is obviously not great, as you probably all know, but also that impact the ocean with their activities. And we see the sustainable blue economy as a kind of vision for these sectors to evolve into, so to speak. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I think when I started at UNEP 3 years ago, the insurance industry, and I hadn't had that much touch points with the insurance industry before, but I was pleasantly surprised because the insurers seemed to be ahead of the curve on this topic, because they had been starting to assess things like ocean risk. So, and that would then include, obviously, vessel insurance, of course, the classical maritime insurance, but also looking at coastal areas and storm protection, flood protection, and so on. And so they're the first ones also to explore the exciting field of nature-based solutions. So that was a great surprise, very positive. And I think for insurers, when we talk about the blue economy, but also nature as a whole, they are playing and will play a massive role in influencing this much needed and urgent transition to a sustainable future. And that can happen on the kind of insurance and underwriting side. It can happen on the investment side as well. So there's really a lot to do. And one thing I might want to highlight here is that what insurers, I think, need to do is moving on from kind of after the fact disaster risk insurance to really working on some forward-looking protective measures and project and deals, really to try to mitigate before the damage is done, which is often also way more cost-effective, of course, which I think no one is going to complain about.
Thank you, Dennis. And follow-up question, so just looking at the wider nature agenda. So I think people are quite familiar already with the Paris Agreement, but even that's a whole thing to unpack. And the Global Biodiversity Framework is relatively new. Can you unpack that a little bit more? I don't think I did justice to it, but but what are the core elements there that make it purposeful and useful? And why do we think it will be a game changer? Yeah.
That's a good question, and I probably won't be as comprehensive as because we have a limited time. But essentially, it is always seen as the equivalent of the Paris Agreement, but on the nature side. And there's maybe 2 or 3 things that I would like to highlight that make it really unique. One is, and you mentioned it, Dorothy. It's this 30 by 30 target. So really aiming to come together as a global community to protect at least, and I want to highlight that, at least 30% of ocean water and land spaces to protect them and ideally keep them in a wild state for various reasons, of course. And I think that is a massive achievement. In the lead up to it, it was not clear if that was going to stay in the final text. So this is, I think, the biggest the biggest achievement there. Another point I would like to highlight is as well that it was really crucial that indigenous voices were heard and included in the process. So there's, as you might know, indigenous peoples and communities are the best stewards of biodiversity globally, and that was very much highlighted in the final agreement as well, which is really important. Make sure that there are rights for indigenous peoples to be heard and also be allowed to manage their ancestral lands as well, which I think is quite crucial, and again something that wasn't necessarily a given from the get-go.
Good. Let's go to solutions, nature-based solutions, which Son had touched on later. And I'm going to ask you, Dorothy, and Sonje, yes or no? Is there insurance for forests in the Congo? Is there?
Oh.
No?
Some parts have that kind of insurance, and I'll unpack in a few.
Okay. Are the reefs by Mozambique insured?
I'm not so sure about that.
Right. Is the Great Green Wall of Africa insured?
There are discussions. There are discussions.
Okay. The reason why I asked the question is because the Belize Barrier Reef is insured. The Mesoamerican Reef by Cancun is insured. Mangrove forests in the Philippines, there are already pilot solutions there where conservation of mangroves leads to reduction in insurance premiums for non-life insurance for coastal communities if you conserve and protect mangrove, which are carbon sinks, and also buffers for storm surge, right? And the reason why I ask is because we mentioned that Africa has a lot of natural treasures, the ecosystems here. It's already in Namibia's constitution. So why can't we, what is stopping us from having insurance for nature-based solutions?
One, probably lack of awareness across board. So that is lack of awareness both in the industry of insurance as well as also the insured. People to appreciate what is this all about nature and how it impacts them. The risks involved with it as well as opportunities involved with it. So that is one. Another is also the complexity and uncertainties of, if I may say, nature and how it's related to finance and insurance. Mostly I like to say, you know how nature is complex. It's, you know, there's the food chain and the food web. The food chain is pretty simple. You have grass, it's eaten by a goat, and then the goat is eaten by man. It's pretty linear. But then you have food web, which is complex. The goat can be eaten by something else, and then it dies, and then it's eaten. It's a web just like this. So that complexity is not really well understood, and how it can be linked up to, as I say, finance or insurance. And also just also linking the impacts which are caused by, if it's insurance also, and also the activities of insurance. So there's that. And there's also, a lot of our businesses, if I may say, in Africa, sadly tend to be, you know, short-term, if I may say, especially the bulk of it, if it's whether the SMEs and also the MSMEs, because some of them actually, in fact, shut down before a long time. And when you think about environmental matters, nature matters included, as well as climate and all environmental matters, are long-term. And so if you see the businesses who are supposed to be working together to solve these nature issues are short-term, then you can imagine there's a misalignment. So those are just some of three which pop into the mind, but I believe Dorothy can mention more.
Just to add on to what Sonje has said, I think the biggest challenge, and having just moved about a month ago, the main question on what is nature positive? What are you talking about? We're just trying to wrap our heads around climate agenda and TCFD. Then all of a sudden you're bringing a new monkey called TNFD, another burden onto our books. And I think just one of the things that we are getting to understand, and especially as we engage with African institutions, is unpacking the fundamentals of nature as key. Because you cannot provide solutions in this market. I liked what Philip said, we borrow with pride. And while we are borrowing, we need to borrow with pride, but there needs to be a basic understanding. And just defining nature from the context of TNFD, land, ocean, fresh water, and the air. Then we talk about biodiversity. In the world, it's estimated that there are about 8.7 million species in the world. Out of these, only 1.2 million have been databased. Those are the ones that have been identified, and they're mostly insects. So you can imagine data within even that ecosystem is difficult. And then we also talk about natural capital. Natural capital are the non-renewable and renewable resources, including soil. So many of us may not even know that soil absorbs carbon, that grasslands absorb carbon. You will think that when a place looks very dry like the savannah, there's nothing much it is doing, yet it is doing a lot for that ecosystem. Maintaining the soil the way it should, the structures the way they should. Those short grasses actually absorb carbon. Apart from that, many times people may ask, okay, so what happens, for example, within these grasslands? What do animals eat? Animals, like Sonje said, they eat different parts. So there are those that eat more of the higher grasslands. There are more that eat the shrubs. There are more that eat more of the leaves. And each of these species are very important. Now, onto your question, Butch. Why has it not been done in Africa? Yet, the Yucatan Peninsula has actually ensured the coral reefs and a lot of the mangroves. Those discussions are ongoing. And as indicated within the pilot institutions and within what I'll talk about, the African Natural Capital Alliance, many of these institutions have actually started doing this. The challenge still remains, it's complex, it needs partnerships. Remember, in this market, we have scientists who sometimes sit in a corner, in a box somewhere. Financial sector, ourselves, we are sitting here. Regulator is sitting up there. The community, we don't remember the community. And that really poses a big challenge. So learning and borrowing with pride from those markets who have been able to bring science, finance, communities, regulation, all aligned with their national strategies, have actually been able to do a lot. And for this heavy government involvement, including at the Yucatan Peninsula, for example, what the people who pay, the institutions who pay the premiums are actually hotels along the coastal line. They are actually saying, we will pay premiums to ensure that the mangroves are protected, to ensure that the coral reefs are protected, because when these coral reefs, the acidification occurs, or the mangroves get destroyed, then we don't have a good coastline, and then we don't have tourists, and then flooding comes, and then as insurers, what do we tell these hotels, even in Africa? Build a seawall. In Kenya, I can tell you, and I won't name them, there are those hotels, as a risk manager, we say, build a seawall. And these insurers have these hotels have built seawalls. But guess what? When the water comes, it's redirected into another place and messes up the entire ecosystem. And then you see flooding now occurring further downstream. You see now the fish supply. You see the breeding of fish that was meant to take place doesn't take place as well. So basically, this is a topic that has to bring science to finance, so that all institutions and all parties involved can actually develop solutions that work and work for this market.
Thank you, Dorothy. I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned, which I think is very true. So I've been talking to many insurers around the world, including reinsurers. The most sophisticated ones on climate, for example, if you look at in their teams, they have scientists who are doing risk modeling. So Swiss Re is an example. I know one guy there, and he's now with ETH in Zurich. I'm talking about climate risk modeling, catastrophe modeling. And this is true everywhere, because the ESG narrative means there are new skills and things to be learned that have to be assimilated in this context by an underwriter or insurance professionals. You won't do something that you don't know, right? So does this make the case for an NPA, a Nature Positive Academy? Could insurance associations be that? And I'm looking at Patty because she's the chair of the OSI, Organization of Eastern and Southern African Insurers. She's in the ExCom of the African Insurance Organization. Should we not have that, Patty? So Patty will take it forward with OSI and AIO, that nature will be part of the curriculum of insurance institutes there, because I think otherwise it's going to be hard, right?
Can I just speak on something? And my boss is looking at me here. It's a major thing that we are going to be focusing on the next 1 year. We're actually building at FSD, we are building the Premier Africa Leadership Program on Nature. And that will actually bring in science. Let's not forget technology and data and AI, artificial intelligence, and it's also bringing in finance. It's bringing in, of course, the SMEs, the startups that we need. And we want to create 100 or develop 100 champions who are going to drive the nature discussion across the continent. So look out, because we are going to be doing a call. Once we get the final approvals, we will be doing a call to get these champions on board and to train you in the best leadership programs that you can find.
Thank you.
May I just add just one thing? First of all, that sounds great. Great idea, and also I hope that academy is happening. I think this nature topic is kind of a curse, because it's so much more complex and location specific compared to climate, as you said, Butch. But it also forces, I'm hoping, it forces financial actors, one, to listen to the science, because the scientists are the only ones that kind of understand it. And secondly, it forces people to think holistically and in systems, which is something that, especially in the blue economy space previously, you would look fisheries in a silo and shipping in a silo and agriculture in a silo, but you only realize the impacts and dependencies if you look at everything together. And I think this nature topic really forces, if you're doing it right, and I'm hoping the TNFD is doing some of that, forcing financial institutions and others to really look at this holistically, to know that if you have agricultural runoff into the coastal area, this will affect your tourism, this will affect your local fisheries, this will affect your local water sports, and therefore you have to engage in a conversation with many different stakeholders, and that maybe is a positive outcome of this conversation.
Right, and I wanted to ask Sonje and Dorothy your perspective, because there's a just transition in climate, there's also a just transition on nature. And I wonder whether there's something, because one of the strengths of the biodiversity framework is that we've said that one of the best custodians and guardians of nature are indigenous peoples. Isn't that a good way to actually be more socially inclusive and get them into this agenda? What's happening on that front in Africa?
Yeah, actually, that's true what you've said. In fact, it has been noted in a number of countries and also globally, the people who work closely with indigenous people get to really preserve nature. Case in point, like in Kenya, where I come from, as I said, the coast, Mijikenda, it's known to work with the elders who are called Kaya, the indigenous people, who end up taking care of the forest and the nature around there. Like case in point, there's a forest which is not known much, even in Kenya itself, called the Arabuko Sokoke forest. It used to run from Somalia to Mozambique, but now because of deforestation, it's only in Kenya and just in Malindi area. And my father used to tell me a lot, may he keep resting in peace, he used to tell me a lot when they used to work when they used to preserve a lot of that nature with the Kaya people and the elders, then there was a lot of even, biodiversity which would be seen there. Case in point, like the dugongs and there are Adais dukas. There are quite a number of species who are also endemic to that area because it's unique, and they would get to be preserved. But now, sadly, that is not happening much. And in fact, it's one of the collaboration I would want, or I would be happy to see pushed forward, because we talk about a lot of these other collaborations, whether it's peer-to-peer, whether it's PPP with the private sector and public sector. But if we can work a lot with the indigenous people, then I believe we can be able to move forward. And it's not that they don't have information. They actually know how to preserve this. We are in Namibia, I believe The Gods Must Be Crazy was from here. You remember, if you've watched that movie? You remember how they used to take care of the environment? They knew.
That's from the 80s, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that person, they used to know even the nature. They could look at the footprint of the animal and could actually tell what it was suffering from, and they knew exactly how to treat it. So those are just some of the examples we need to bring back and really collaborate with the indigenous people.
Great. I'm going to check in with the floor. Any question? Because before I ask a big question, any question from the floor for our distinguished panel? Yes, we have Waikari, and I think we have Monday, who's going to be on the next panel, Chief Risk Officer. I hope I got it correctly. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. My question to the panel is this, okay? Now, you've spoken about so many aspects of nature-based solutions, okay? Now, given the current poverty status in most of African countries, so this project, are they not capital intensive? And what priority does this ecosystem framework play in the priorities of the African governments? And finally, how do you quantify the benefits of eco-based insurance solutions? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
I can take that. So your question are these priorities? Many countries signed on to the global, or rather accepted or agreed to implement the global biodiversity framework. Many of these, and if you check, you'll see many of the governments that are already trying to develop their own nature strategies and roadmaps. Why? Because there's a significant understanding that nature plays a key agenda or key role in economic resilience. Actually, data puts it as 65% of Africa's GDP is highly dependent on nature. That's a huge amount, or a huge quota. And so many of these institutions have actually, many of these countries have recognized this, and some of these solutions are not capital intensive, as we may say. They may be capacity intensive. They need to understand, to know, to create the networks and the partnerships. And from where we sit, we increasingly see available resources and funds that are willing to support some of these initiatives. But the challenge is, where are the projects, or where are the products, or where are the financial institutions who want to be helped or who want to be supported? And of course, this support needs to be sustainable. So where are the solutions that we can pilot, and then with time allow the institutions to actually scale? I think I want to point to one very quick thing on the wildlife conflict that we see. In Kenya, 2 weeks ago, we actually lost 10 lions. And what happened? The Maasai, a number of indigenous people, actually literally speared the lions. And because these lions would come and kill their livestock, would just basically terrorize them. And there was a feeling that not much was being done. As we speak, within our country in Kenya, the Kenya Wildlife Service owes victims, wildlife victims, about $9.5 million in compensation. Now, they have done their best to pay as much as they can within the shortest period that they can. But therein lies the opportunity for insurers. And I'm so happy Nazria is here. Nazria, I think there was a lady from Nazria who spoke earlier. These are some of the institutions, some of the anchor African Capital, the Natural Capital Alliance members, who are actually looking at wildlife compensation schemes as a key aspect to solve that challenge that the government needs to do something. They have the will and the power to do something about it. And these institutions are willing to put in place, willing to risk capital to put in place to actually support victims. So yes, there is a plan, and many of these countries are doing something about it, including our very own in Kenya.
Thank you, Dorothy. And Dennis is not going to the Namib Desert. He's just going to the next room because he's speaking there. So your excuse.
Yeah. If I could just add something small to that. Yes, as you've mentioned, yes, some solutions tend to be capital intense. But this is something which I like to say in Africa, we need also to stop looking at ourselves as victims. We have our own very own solutions. Besides depending on, the financing from outside, our own corporates, some of them tend to have funds which they want to take towards CSR, but they don't know how to use it. So if we come together, as you say, work together as partners, even in different sectors, get maybe the banks on board, the other corporates on board, to channel their CSR money into some of these pools which can be used to work together towards nature-based solutions. Instead of also waiting for governments, because sadly sometimes also governments delay, and probably some governments are also broke. Let's just work together with what is already in existence here.
Thank you. And I think Monday, I'm pretty sure on the UN side, one of the best papers on climate change before was the economics of climate change. We've done some work on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, or TEEB series, makes the argument on why it makes sense to invest in nature. So I'm sure there's literature there that we can use, particularly in an African context, to show why we need to value nature beyond what we think its value is, right? So my last question, and because we're out of time, is for Dorothy. And it could be yes or no, and you shouldn't look at Kelvin or Philip when you answer this. The question is that, so my vision for Africa and the Middle East is that there should be if there's an Africa climate risk facility, should we not have an Africa nature risk facility? So the question is, if we're saying that nature and climate are two sides of the same coin, should that be part of the climate? Should nature be part of the climate risk facility that's being finalized right now, or not?
Yes, and it can be, and it's because we have within nature-based solutions, we have climate and disaster risk solutions. Remember, the Africa Risk Facility is insuring against floods, cyclones, tropical cyclones, drought, and then early warning systems. So that's one. Secondly, you can insure on environmental liability, or for environmental liability. Again, if something happens, pollution, etc., then there's a capacity to actually insure that. And so yes, it can. There are other schemes, carbon credit insurance schemes, that are in external markets, that are gaining momentum. Africa is very rich. We have the second largest rainforest in the world, and a lot of forests again. So yes, that is practically possible. And then there's invasive species insurance, which is also, can be part of what is rolled out. So yes, it is possible, and it should be possible.
Great. So the same conclusion with the earlier panel. Just like Namib, the vast range of opportunities for nature-positive insurance exists, and we could have it in the facility. There could be independent solutions being done right now, aside from data, technical competence, skill set, and obviously government support on this. But thank you so much to you, Sonje, to Dorothy, and to Dennis, who left for the other room for this panel. And we'll carry on the last session on insurance.